So there's a lot of conversation happening right now in our world, especially on the issue of race. And I think one of the parts of the conversation that's missing is the fact that everybody's coming from different contexts, right? We've been locked up inside with the coronavirus. We haven't been able to get out. And so everybody's critiquing everybody else's experience based on their own. But I think that there's a missing element for the believers on how to take action and whether or not this whole thing is something that we can relate to. So we've known each other a long time, but those that are watching right now, they may not know you. So would you speak from your experience and from your context, both you personally and also the church that you minister in?
How far back do you want me to go?
I mean, you could start personally, your upbringing, and then you can talk about your current church context.
Okay, so I grew up back and forth between Harlem and the Bronx in the 80s. A lot of drug-infested neighborhood, poverty, crime, and then moved to New Jersey when I was about 19. Because I grew up in the elements that I grew up in, what was popular was, drug dealers, basketball, or football, athletics, athletes. So I played a lot of basketball, played a little bit of baseball because you need to gather a whole team together, but played basketball because just like everybody else in the neighborhood, we thought we were either going to be rappers or we were going to be basketball players, some kind of sports,
Yeah.
And I don't know how big, rap was on the uprising, right? So it was like that generation behind, like maybe the first generation that kicked it off, right? But those were like, hey, we can do this, and then, hey, you want to make money, want to look right, you can sell some drugs, right? So I was very young when I inquired about selling drugs. And the first time I started dealing drugs for about a week, a guy gave me some crack cocaine, and crack cocaine was $3 per bottle, right? Wow. But the profit that I would only make was going to be $1. And so I easily calculated that at a young age and said, well, if I wanted a pair of Jordans, which cost $126, then that would take 126 risk for me to purchase these sneakers when that person's getting $2, per on the profit. And so that sent me on a different path. Let that go after a week. And then as I got a little older, the opportunity came for me to get involved with drug dealing. So I did that. I did that in New Jersey, mostly. And also I lived also in Washington, D.C., Maryland, right outside of Washington. There was in Silver Springs. And I lived there as well for a year and a half. And so it's always around these environments, right? And then at 22 years old, I got saved. Yeah. Came into a church after church hopping because I had gone to several churches, and my only real premise in going to a church was that looking back, I would say now, probably wanted to ease my conscience because what I would do is, go to these churches looking to see who I could be a blessing to. So I go to these churches, and then there was like, oh, if you want a special prayer, if you give them more than $100, you get on this line, get this prayer. And as a non-believer, I was, man, this is a hustle, and you could see it, like, it was just bad, right? And one day, I was going to the city to meet my wife, girlfriend at the time, to go to a church in the city. And that day, things had shifted. Long story short was, I ended up being invited to Old Bridge, Calvary Chapel Old Bridge, right? And when I was first invited, I said, I don't want to go to your corny white church, right? So I had a bias,
Yeah.
I had racism in my heart because my influence was Tupac Shakur and the music that I was listening to. In fact, Tupac Shakur had a song at that time that I used to actually ride in Wall Street and different places, This White Man's World.
Yeah.
And that was the context in what I was fed, grew up around seeing police brutality, all of that stuff, we seen it. And even on the train, when I rode the train in New York City at 96th Street, all the Caucasians were off the train at 96th Street unless it was a day when a Yankee game was going on and they were riding up to the Bronx.
Yeah.
So I see stuff or whatever. However, when I went to church, I realized there was something different there. And when I say different, I saw that it wasn't a hustle as far as finance. It wasn't, they were teaching the word. And I was convicted by the word. And it impacted me in such a way where that place became my schoolhouse. What I also learned was there was a young group, and other than getting expelled from a school, I never had gone to school with whites at all, right? Even I got expelled early in 3rd grade, and that was fighting with a white kid. And then when I got to high school, I had this basketball opportunity and got into a situation where I was expelled. So I had some white people in that school. But other than that, I didn't have white friends, Asian friends, Indian friends, whatever. Now, that being said, when I came to Old Bridge, there was a younger crowd that embraced me, right? And I started to believe, well, you know what? Everything that I'm fed is not all accurate, right? And so, the first dude that gave me Why Grace Changes Everything was Asian. Ming? Mm-hmm. Ming gave me that book, right? And had me read that, right? Caesar. Caesar took me to Campus Crusades at Rutgers, right? I'm in a element that it was so far from me. And you can look at that and say, oh, you know what? They embraced you because you were the kid off the street and you look like this thug in this church or whatever like that. Whatever the premise was, what I'm saying is I felt like the love of Christ. Right. I felt welcomed, right? Not that I wasn't welcomed in my elements where I was at, right, before Christ, but I felt a sense of welcome and embrace. Vinny Whitehead, was an embrace, and so I started hanging out with a lot of those guys, and Jason Cardone and Jason Kolbeff, and not Kolbeff, I'm sorry, Jason Klum, right, and those guys, and so it was a real cool thing. And that had become my schoolhouse. And although I can say other times I felt different things, that's where God had planted me. Yeah, and this is something we talked about offline, but a lot of people say stuff like, I don't see color, right? I don't know if that's necessarily the most helpful distinction, because people did see you and they sought you out and embraced you, right? So for me, and you tell me if I'm wrong, it seems like we should have a little bit more sensitivity for the people who are coming in with sensitivity. So people like yourself who are coming in with your guard up, we need to be more aware of that and more intentional in our efforts to make that person feel welcome. And it doesn't have to do with just race. It could be the single mom who comes in, who feels like they have baggage. It could be a person who can't even barely speak English and they're coming in conscious or self-aware, or the person who feels certain ways about their body image. Every person who steps in, we're being intentional about the way that we love that person and making them feel included into the body of Christ. Yeah, that's a good word, Alan, because yes, you heard the term I used before even walking in the doors. I had gone there one time prior, but I had a perception, right? But then walking in, so yeah, like it's predominantly white, right? And I didn't grow up that way, but right, like the term to say I don't see color, I think it's offensive. And I also believe that it's not wise if you want to reach people, right? If the goal is to reach people and make an impact for the gospel, then I want to learn the words, the things that I should and shouldn't be saying, right? When I go to certain churches, you know, to communicate, I want to communicate effectively, right? And so, you know, some of my slang may come out, but ultimately I'm trying to define words that you can comprehend. And if I want to touch your heart, you know, what would it be for me to stand up on the mic and be like, you know, there's a room of a bunch of crackers. That would be crazy, right? Like, that's offensive.
Right.
Right? And so when you approach, look, I'm black, and if I'm approaching another black person, I never say, yo, you know what? I never see color. Mm-hmm. The mere fact that you just said that tells me you saw it.
Right.
And the antenna goes up for an individual. Now, I know the intent, what you're trying to say, you're trying to peel down the wall. You know, I'm about the heart. A guy was here this past Sunday and said the very same thing. Oh, I don't see color. There's no race in the Bible. And I'm saying, whoa. You may get away with that in the church. You'll never get away with it in our community.
Yeah. And that's the point too, is it's well-intentioned. It's not like when people say that they're meaning anything malicious, but when they say that, they're being ignorant of the people that are, you know, suffering currently right now. And so I think it's similar with the whole thing about how the problem isn't racism, it's sin.
Right.
That's another thing you hear, right? Mm-hmm. For me, what I'm thinking about is we wouldn't say that about abortion. It's a true statement. The problem is always sin, but yes, we're going to fight abortion too. And God holds the people of Israel accountable. And throughout the Bible, you see people are held accountable for specific sins. Right. God doesn't just say, hey, there's a lot of sin happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. Mm-hmm. He's calling out specific sins. And I think it's okay for us to call out specific sins. Otherwise, we leave it unaddressed when we don't call it out.
That's right. That's a good word. And just even thinking on those terms is that there was an offering for all sins, right? However, there was no offering for willful sin and disobedience, right? Like, but when we have sin, and this has been my heart in this season as we navigate through it, right? Is that we would deal with the residue in the church, right? Like, not so much that people aren't saved, not, you know, that, oh, this individual is a racist and all of that, but we all have biases in our hearts. And I think if we come to the cross and lay those down and let the Lord sanctify us in those blind spots, we may not even realize it. Yeah. Right? It may be as innocent, you know, I'm not a racist, and you know, but you'll start to see biases if you would just listen to people and even the other side of the coin, right? And so the same way in my experience coming into that church, right, I started to learn that everything I thought and assumed about whites was not actually the truth, right? Now, because we're in a church and there's there's sin, right? Yeah, you may see elements of that, but let's have the conversation. Let's deal with the residue. People that I have felt that tension with, I've had a conversation with them, and our relationship grew when we were able to converse. Right. But well, yeah, that's just your opinion, or when you come like that, I'm saying, whoa. Yeah. Any brother or sister to come to you with an ought, and you defend instead of hearing it out, that's just lack of humility. Absolutely. Yeah. Right? At its lowest, right? Like, it's just like, if it's not a lack of humility, then what is it? Like, I'm offended that you said something to me. Why we're defensive?
Yeah.
If we're iron sharpening iron, right? If our hearts are really desiring to grow together. And that's why I think we need to do better. We need to do better in deepening our relationships.
Yeah.
Relationships go deeper when they're able to have the real conversations. And I see a lot of believers, they know a lot of word and stuff, but shallow. And they hide behind their knowledge of the word, but they don't really want to deal with the difficult things.
Yeah.
How are we going to go deep?
Now, I think maybe the reason why a lot of people get defensive is they feel like they're being held accountable for somebody else's sin. So police officers are upset because of a couple bad eggs.
Right.
Or white people are upset because it seems like what the black community wants them to do is feel guilty and feel remorseful for even being born white.
Right.
So what do you say to that?
So number one, I'll say, whenever I hear, say, like a black person think that they should receive some reprobation because of slavery and all of that, I think it's a bunch of junk, right? Like, that's just me, right?
Yeah.
You get up, you work, you do what you have to do to move forward. Now, that being said, I don't want people to have white guilt. I don't need anybody to bow any knee or feel pity for me or, oh, I'm so sorry for you. I don't need that, right? And nor, well, I'll just speak for even when I present questions like that to the guys in the streets, right? That's not even what they're asking for.
Yeah.
And I needed to do this in this time for sure, because understand, I've been walking with the Lord for over 20 years. My worldview has changed drastically, right? And so in order to understand at ground level what the world is going through, I needed to engage them. Hey, white evangelicals are going to be asking me some questions. I don't want to answer according to what I think or even what I feel at this point, right? I want to be able to answer how the world is hearing and processing this information and things that are going on around them right now. And one of the things that one of the guys says to me, like, I don't need no payback. We're asking for help even with educational things, you know? And so for me, it's not about, oh, feel sorry for me, bow a knee to me, and any of that. I don't need that, right? And people don't really need that, right? They need to have opportunity. And I will say, like, when I say, hey, get up and get a job, right? There's a lot of elements that come behind that. It's not as easy as, hey, I walk into Old Bridge, don't have a criminal record, I get saved on Sunday, tomorrow I can go fill out applications and get a job because of whatever, right? And there's other elements to that. When people come in here and get saved, there's a whole process before that. And then what kind of job, what kind of quality of life, and that has many legs to it.
So it's kind of like, you don't need people to feel bad, but you do, and I think a lot of the black community is looking for police officers to call out bad eggs, for white people to stand up and say something and not just pretend like it's not an issue at all.
Right.
So you don't have to claim the issue as your own issue, but at least say it's an issue.
Right. And so when you look at, say, the George Floyd situation, right, and you see Derek's knee on his neck, and then there's other officers there. Now, one person put out a rap song and said, man, stop filming and do something while this man's knee is on my neck. Now, if I'm listening to that and I'm seeing that, there's only but so much I could do. I can say, hey, man, let up, bro, like whatever, but get involved to the point where I'm pushing them off? I'd be dead. We'd all be dead. And the narrative would change. And therefore now everybody that's dead is justifiably dead because I got involved. Now you turn that around to the other cops that are standing along, and if the boys in blue, if one of them would have said, hey, let's ease up, or we got him here, let's put him in a car, whatever. But to stand there And just as much as America and people are saying to be silent in a situation like this is to be in agreement, that's the same narrative, I would say, is the same when you have other officers standing there and this man's knee is on the back and you work with him. You're gonna say something. See something, do something, right? Terrorism, we say that, see something, do something. See something, say something, right? Same kind of concept.
Yeah, and so we were talking a lot about your personal background, but I think at this point it's helpful to talk about your church context, since not everybody lives in an urban community. We're in Newark.
Yes.
And we're not just in a part of Newark, we're in a specific part of Newark. So why don't you describe a little bit of what it's like to be here?
Yep, so first, 1967, Newark had race riots, right? This area right here, we're in the center of 4 low-income housing. This community is a little different because there's a Portuguese-Brazilian element to it, opposed to where we moved from. However, it's still poverty, prostitution, drugs, gangs, that kind of world, right? And we have been here for 6 years and have lived here now for 4 years. Just a little context is, at 22 years old, I bought a house in Jackson, New Jersey. 3 years later, sold it, moved to Manchester, Toms River, New Jersey. Lived there for 3 more years, sold that house, moved up to Kearney, helped with a church plant, lived there for a year, then bought a house in Bloomfield, and lived there for about 10, 11 years, and now we're here. So I say that to say, for those of us who just think that, oh, you just lived in that world all the time and that's it.
Yeah.
Right? The point is, I was able to achieve the American dream, so to say.
Yeah.
Right? And God called me back in to a very similar context in which I grew up in to impact people for his namesake, right? And so that's where we're at. Yeah.
And I think, unfortunately, I've seen a lot of things kind of denying systemic racism. And I think it's a lot easier to see it here than it is in other areas, maybe more affluent areas. But what would you say to that? Like, what would be your examples of how the system is putting people at a disadvantage? Especially because usually the rebuttal from white conservative people is, well, I mean, look at the rap music. I mean, they're portraying this certain image of themselves, so how do we know that's all our fault and it's everything that we're doing? So what are some examples of systemic racism that you see in your community?
Well, I'll say even right now, through this process of quarantine, right, our community is suffering, and because we lack resources. Right, I look at kids that are supposed to be doing school, and you may be in a community where you have a computer, laptop. Let's get even a little deeper. In my house, my children who are in school were able to do school because they had the resources. In the midst of the pandemic, there was a situation that erupted where we had to take in 3 young ladies from the community to live with us. All 3 of them are in school, 10-year-old, 14, 17. They were so behind in schooling because they didn't have a simple computer to do schooling. They were trying to do school on their phones, having to share phones because all of them don't have phones. You know, I looked at the girl's phone one time and I'm like, how can you read that? You know, versus being able to sit at the table with a laptop, iPad, whatever. So even in that, when you look at the schools, the resource provision is totally different. The books, the after school kind of care and so forth that you see around here. It's different.
Yeah.
Right? It's different because, and this is how I know it's different, because I lived in both. My kids went to blue ribbon schools and suburban schools, and so I know the resources are different.
Yeah.
I've lived it, right? It's not like, oh, it's my bent on life. This is something I live.
And even to your point, it's like what we were talking about right before this, how even if you just call it systemic oppression, the point is the system does not primarily think of the minorities, right? So shelter in place, shelter in place is great if you're
right.
saying to me,
If you have a swimming pool, or you got space in your house, you know what? Shelter in place is not therapeutic for the individual that their mother is strung out on drugs. Even the deadbeat dad that's in the house verbally abusing or even domestically abusing the children and the parent, when there's not enough food in the refrigerator, right? Where I'm talking about people not that's just laying on their behinds, but people that were trying to find jobs and putting in the work to get applications in and so forth like that. But this is their condition when their homes look the way they look. It's chaotic and it's stressful. Right? I mean, look, I'm saved, walking with the Lord, and there's 9 of us, right? Hey, I need some solitude time, right? And so I'm able to sit in my car, I'm able to sit in the church, whatever, and another maybe in the basement, whatever. But you just have one little apartment, neighbors, noise on top of each other. It's different to say shelter in place then. Yeah. I got a pool, and hey, I'll see you later on. Y'all go over there in the playroom or go down. You got a little more space, and so that's different.
And it does no good to anybody for the government to say everybody has an equal opportunity, and so it's all going to work out if you just work hard enough. You have all the avenues and resources at your disposal, and in the church too. When the church doesn't see color, right? And they're not thinking intentionally of the marginalized ones in their fellowship, it makes it that much harder for them to even be able to reach Jesus and be able to meet him, because we haven't even opened the door to them.
Right. When you look at Jesus, right, he fed the multitudes, right, and then ministered to them, right? Yeah. And so even in the same respect, like, hey, and I'm guilty of this, right? When I first came into this city, it was truth, and was no effect. Yeah. And God showed me, you want to be effective? You got truth, but even in the scriptures it says, with mercy and truth, grace and truth, right? So you can have the truth, right? But how are you communicating the truth? Yeah. Right? You look at Jesus in John chapter 4, meeting the woman at the well. If he just hit her with truth, he would have never reached her. Yeah. Which also had racial tension in the context of who she was, right? And so the heart behind, okay, when I'm in those situations, those scenarios, I must be wise in how I communicate. And I think people are communicating truth, but I don't know it. Instead, it's the rhema word, a revelation word. When we're talking to people, we just got a lot of truth, right? And so listen to my spew instead of, God, what would you have me to say to this person? Yeah. And as I'm listening, I could be praying in the spirit and saying, okay, and then speaking. Yeah. I think we need to get back to that, opposed to leaning on our statistics and not being tangible with real people. Right? And even to your point, what you were talking about earlier, right? Like, people been on social media, they're really not touching people. And so you really don't know what people feel and how you can help them adjust their feelings to their, to the truth, right? In the respect of even just as a whole, I learn more about a person when I sit and talk and listen to them.
Yeah, and to do that, you have to be biblical, which means you're Jesus seeking out the Samaritan woman.
That's right.
But because of social media and then quarantine making it infinitely harder. We're all stuck, and we're judging each other, and we're dehumanizing each other because now you're an idea, you're not a person anymore. And for me, I think the thing that really frustrates me is how everybody's made this a political issue rather than a biblical issue.
Right.
So what would you say to that? Because my theory, my standing theory right now is a lot of younger people are seeing what's happening, they're identifying with the suffering, and so they're posting. And now they're saying stuff. But then the very posts that they're asked to make are asking them to buy into an agenda that I may not agree with and you may not agree with. And that's political agendas. That's fund this organization, get the money in the right pockets, and vote for these politicians, and then we'll be able to fix all the problems. Right. And then our conservative older parents are looking at that and dismiss the whole thing. Racism's not real because I see my kids getting brainwashed, you know? So how do we steer clear of political forms of trying to fix our problems and stay on the biblical issue?
So I would say the mission, knowing the goal. The goal is Jesus. The goal is the gospel. Yes, we identify that people have sin, and you know the remedy is salvation.
Yeah.
Agree. Not discounting that, not putting on a lower scale, right? But the reality is when we engage people and we want to be effective, right? We got to start by listening. How did we reach white America, right? Or even minister to the white evangelical church when Obama was in office? You understand what I'm saying? Asking, right? Because they had a problem with him in office. Yeah. And I'm not speaking from opinion. I'm speaking from what I heard, what I read. And now, what we, the church, right, the redeemed, we must understand we're not in this world to save this nation. That's not my mission, right? We are pilgrims passing through. That's what the scriptures tell us. Yeah. We are not of this world, right? So if that is the truth, then you know what? Just as much as I would say, hey, I'm a Christian before I'm black, right? On the other side, people need to understand they're Christian before they're white, but even furthermore, that they're Christian before they're American. Yeah. And what I'm starting to see is the political part of it being even the influence in the church. And so the church is doing this. They're saying, you know what? America's burning down. We got to save America. Well, maybe it will burn down. And maybe that's what it takes in order for people to wake up and come to the cross. Yeah. Right? Because we've been dependent on all of our resources. The economy's doing well. I'm doing well. I'm living in sweet places. All of these things that are happening. But maybe that needs to be ripped. Those idols need to be torn down. Yeah. And so if we're in that element where, you know what? We did all that, the church did all that they could when Obama, you remember when Obama was going out, his 8 years was done, and we thought Hillary was coming in. We did everything we could to make sure that didn't happen. And you know it's really sad? People that say, oh, don't use the pulpit for politics. They spend seasons to use the pulpit for politics. Yeah. Right? Go listen to the messages. I bet you if you stood in their churches, you knew who they voted for and who they were encouraging without maybe saying who to vote for. You knew, you were real clear what the message was. Yeah. And what we try to steer clear of in the diversity of our church, for sure, people don't know who I vote for. They could assume. But you know one thing they do know is that they're going to get Jesus. Yeah. right? And so we need to get back to the goal. The goal is not to save America, but to save souls.
Yeah.
And if we get back on that track and not to embrace, watch this, we're embracing political voices that are unredeemed.
Yeah.
So like when you look at Owen speaking out, there was no grace in her speech. Mm-hmm. So I know for sure if I played that out here, even though there was a lot of truth, I remember Andrew Descoli said this. He said, fact without tact will get you smacked. And if we want to be effective in our delivery, if we want to touch somebody, if we want to see a life really transformed, then we must be able to ask the Lord, Lord, how do I speak this so that it's effective?
Yeah.
And so we got to stop looking at the unredeemed as gospel.
Yeah.
We got to start looking back into our Bibles, or maybe we need to step back from our Bibles because we are too close to the forest to see the trees. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people have the truth. And I see that. And that's why sometimes I have these kind of conversations. I'm not trying to give you a bunch of Bible. We already know that. The same way you go to a pastor's conference, you hear more Bible teaching, exposition. We don't need that. Somebody needs to give somebody the truth in revelation and understanding how to apply the scriptures to their day-to-day living. When's the last time that we engage people? I'm talking about the people in the pulpit. When's the last time we really not just prepared messages, but talked to the non-believer, the people on the ground level, people who are broken?
Yeah.
We preaching, we giving a lot of sermons.
Yeah.
When are we going to touch people? When are we going to get back out and touch our communities? And really, is not even bridging the gap, right? Like that's not a pun or anything, but we need to bridge the gap between races, lifestyles, all of that. We need to be able to bring them together. And you brought out a good point. Because Jesus went and sorted out, why shouldn't we?
Yeah.
And what I see is, and what I want for myself and what I want other people to learn is this, man. I want a heart like Jesus. I want a heart like God. Mm-hmm. You see, like the prophets, not all of them, but think about like Jonah. He didn't have God's heart at the time when God called him to carry out a mission, to reach some people that didn't look like him, didn't, act like him, and they treated them with injustice. Yeah. Right? But it was God's heart to have compassion on them. That's what he says. Hey, should I not have pity on these people who do not know their right hand from their left? That's God's heart. Yeah. Jonah said, I'm not going there. But God got him there. Yeah. And maybe this season, this time, is a time where we've been saying, I'm not going there. I'm going to Tarshish. And God's saying, no, you're not. You're going to go to Nineveh. You remember that revival you've been praying for years? Now is the time.
Yeah. You bring up a lot of points there. A couple of them. Number one, Jesus said, you search the scriptures because you think in them you have life. But if you don't see Jesus in the scriptures, what are you doing? Yes. So prophetic teaching is what we need. Mm-hmm. Second, I'm reminded of early in around the time of Jesus, the disciples were thinking that Jesus was going to be a political savior.
That's right. That's right.
And he had a greater mission. Mm-hmm. And his view was not the Jewish people, it was all nations.
That's right.
Right? So Jesus didn't come to save America or save white Christians. He came to save the world. Mm-hmm. Calvary Chapel movement was started by hippies. Chuck Smith, through his wife, looked at hippies and at first was apprehensive, but welcomed them in. They did crazy things, and that's how God did the last revival. Mm-hmm. And it's possible if we lay down our guards of things that are not the gospel issue, but we take our political things and we put them to the side and ask ourselves, what is God calling me to do? We might have the potential to reach a lot of people and have them come to know Jesus. Right. So I think everything you're saying is spot on there, but it requires us to be able to see clearly. Oh, so you said bridging the gap. I think of Ezekiel 22, when God is saying that the oppressor is doing whatever he wants to do, the poor and the orphan are left behind, and there's no one to stand in the gap on behalf of the people.
That's right.
And I wonder if people spend less time on social media posting this opinion or that opinion and more time in brokenness and prayer before God. So forget about the white guilt thing. Forget about I need to find a black person to confess my white sins to. Can we go before God on behalf of our nation, as Nehemiah was confessing his sin as if, confessing the sins of the Jewish people as if it was his own sin.
That's right.
We have sinned against you, so going before God with that kind of mentality and brokenness so that God is able to birth a revival in his church.
That's a good word. I think of even in Acts when it talks about in chapter 1, waiting, right? And he says, wait until you be endued with power.
Yeah.
And I think this quarantine time was a time of waiting. And if we did not take the time to get what we needed to receive from the Lord, not our, God, fix this, change this, but God, what are you stripping away? What are you dealing with in my heart? What are you stirring in my heart? What are you refocusing me on that I need to not be zeroing in? I got distracted with these things. I repent for the distractions, right? And really come to that place where now that we've waited and now that the transition is happening, if the Holy Spirit is upon us, right, we should be fulfilling the mission that Jesus said was upon him.
Yeah, and the first sign after the day of Pentecost was speaking in the specific languages of the people there.
That's right. That's right. And so when you look at Jesus saying, hey, the Spirit is upon me, right? And what did he do? He set captives free. He healed the brokenhearted.
Yeah.
That's our mission if we're Spirit-filled,
yeah.
right? If we have that heart to go and just really be obedient to how his mission was, we'll get uncomfortable. Right? And we'll walk in the Spirit because he says what? You'll be witnesses unto me. That's the message, but we don't want to go through the process to get the message. Just hear my message.
Yeah.
No, there's a process that we need to yield to him in order for the message to be effective.
Amen.
And I don't just want to do ministry. I want to be effective in what I do.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means it's going to take me a little longer time that I don't want to spend. But you know what? It's not me. It's what he wants to do through us.
Yeah.
And we have to come to a place where, you know what? Sacrificially. We know the word, we know what it means, but we have to come to a place where sacrificially we are surrendered to his plan and purpose for our life. Not building it around our lives. Oh yeah, I sacrifice. I'm gonna play some golf. I'm cruising. But really, what is the mission that God has us on?
Yeah. So let's talk specifics now. Because I think a lot of what we're talking about is that heart behind it. But now, Christians are wrestling with questions like, what do I do about the protests? So can you help us understand the protests and then whether or not a Christian should attend one? What I just said, I need to clarify. Whether or not a white Christian should attend one, because I'm assuming the black Christians are already there.
Right. So I don't know that all the black Christians are there, right? But there are a lot of black people in the crowd, and what you're seeing that's different in this one is that there are more whites in the crowd. Should a person go to a protest? I would ask why. Why do you want to go to the protest, right? If you want to stand with people, right? Because I think there's a standing that white evangelicals have to position themselves to take that, you know what, it's going to cost them. It's going to cost them the people that listen to them. It's going to cost them, to line and align with other believers that don't look like them. It's going to cost them, their social network, perhaps. But they're willing to stand with you, right? And so if that's your plan or that's your purpose in moving in that direction, okay, I get that. If you're going to be a witness, to evangelize, to minister, hey, you better know how you're going to do that, not just, give it up. And like we were talking about before, but being effective and really led of the Spirit in how, because listening is a major part, right? But then communicating effectively is very important as well. And so if you're going there for that purpose, if you're going there to observe and pray, those are good reasons to go to protest, peaceful protests, right? I'm not a big fan of protests and rallies. I think they're, just in my opinion, I think they have little effect, right? People are listening more on these. Why? Because of the riots, the rioting, the looting, right? And you may ask, why are they rioting, right? What people are trying to dismiss is, for years, the slogan has been no justice, no peace. And there has been, throughout the years, no justice, no peace, and there's been a lot of peace, but injustice. Now what's happening is people say, oh, you need to know peace. And I'm by far not going to, like Owen said, well, George Floyd is not my martyr. He's not mine either.
Yeah.
But one thing I can say is that police brutality has occurred multiple times, right? Throughout the years. I'm talking about, you have him with maybe a criminal record, but then you have people throughout without. And the thing with that we must understand is that what often happens is the police are acquitted. Even with the Rodney King case, right? The police were acquitted after seeing that inhumane beating. And it wasn't until they started looting and rioting that things got turned around. So you sit, you wait, you see that throughout the years, you hear it, you try to, create organizations, and I'm not, for, the political aspect of these things. However, I understand, I get it when you're looting now, because you probably assume, remember, they're unredeemed people, right? So you probably assume, what's going to happen again. These guys are going to get off. We just had Aubrey's case. They weren't police officers, but, have another situation, where a young man's just jogging, and here it is, he's dead. And if the video didn't come out, those guys wouldn't have been arrested. And so what I think the good boys in blue should do is really speak to the truth of what's going on, but even that costs in being blackballed. Yeah. I sat with my cousin maybe a few months ago before the quarantine and all of that stuff, and he has a big seat in his department, but he sees and knows and spoke to a lot of the discrimination that happens in the office amongst themselves. And so I understand the protests. I get the rioting. I'm not for it, right? Because this is the thing you got to understand too. And there's those who are rioting, but then those who are with their political agenda to really, affect the economy, right? The problem is, when you look at people that live just for today, they're not thinking about the consequences of tomorrow. Yeah. And that's what a lot of people I can say in my community, they just live for today. They don't think about tomorrow. They don't know if they're gonna live tomorrow. And when you house people and put them in quarantine for 2 months and so forth, and now they're already on edge, and these things are happening, and they're happening again. But even bigger than that, it's the signs of the times. Yeah. And that's what I think. The scriptures say, hey, in the last days, lawlessness will abound. It's abounding. And these are distractions, just like when the offices are changing, these are distractions that if we remember to keep the mission Christ, to continue to move forward in how God wants to use us, to embrace broken people. There's broken people, they're looking for hope. They're acting like that because they have no hope.
Yeah.
Right? You have the hope. And it's more than people walking into your church building. God disarmed the church right now, right? Like, we're getting back to it and stuff like that. But what did you do during that time? Was the church mobilized? Or was it just, I got to get back to the building because that's where my identity is at?
Yeah.
No. The church is mobile. We're the church.
Yeah. So this is a touchy subject, but you mentioned police brutality. And a lot of people deny that completely. Say it's a couple bad people. In general, it doesn't really happen. On the other hand, you have people who say, let's defund the police, which we wouldn't agree with either.
Right.
How do you, like, where is your basis? Do you see police brutality in your community? And what are the ways that we correct that?
Yeah. I've been a part of excessive force, right? Sometimes warranted, other times not, right? I've had encounters with the police even as a believer, to which I know I wasn't mishandling or misrepresenting the Lord in how I was dealing with the authorities.
Yeah.
And the way that they deal, right? So, is police brutality real? Yes. Like, my own experience speaks to that, right? So people that say, oh, it's not real, or whatever, I would say I just had a conversation. My son just got his license, and I just had to inform him on how to deal with a police officer pulling him over. Everybody doesn't have to do that, right? Couple of months, well, about 8 months ago, the police are out here. They pull a guy over, I know. They run down on a bunch of cops. I go outside and I stand outside. Why? Just to make sure if you're going to arrest him, make a proper arrest. If you're going to give him a citation, give him a citation. But don't do too much, right? Why do I feel like that as a pastor? The other night, Saturday night, 10, 15 police cars are going down to the neighborhood. This is all in the midst of, the hearings of riot starting and stuff like that. I'm in the room there, I put my pants on, shirt on, put my sneakers on, run down the neighborhood. Why? Because I just want to make sure that things are moving smoothly. A few years ago, I'm out here in the front, teenagers, they're with me, right? They're not doing anything, don't have any drugs or anything like that. And I personally watched, and one of them had just been shot by somebody. I personally watched the cop talk to him like he was trash. And I had to step in. They were with me, right? So, and I know him, but I had to report him to his captain because that's why that's one of the reasons why. Yeah. There's a problem with the way the authorities come in the community. And I think it's this is the big thing. In the 67 riots, Bill Iverson, who's like 95 years old now, was a big factor in bridging the gap between the blacks and the police. Why? As a white man. His father's the one that wrote the hymn, Spirit of the Living God, right? Why was he so effective, and why was he the person that the police department called? Because he built relationship. Right. He broke the barriers of race back in the 60s here in this city. And that's why when hard times happened, they knew who they could call on because he had built the relationship. Yeah. The police department needs to build the right relationship with the community. That's good. And if they build the right relationship in the community, then when the hard times come, they'll be able to police better, and they'll be able to have more of an effect, right? Now, that being said, I know there's rebellion towards authority. A lot of that has a lack to do with fathers in the home, a lot of those other issues. But is police brutality real? Yes, I don't know how you could say not. We're just seeing what's shown on the cameras and what the media gets a hold of.
Yeah.
You can't tell me that it doesn't happen more so, and even maybe on a lower level, or maybe somebody didn't die, but maybe they got their behinds whipped, you know. I seen that as young as that I can remember from 10 years old. It's happening, and it doesn't change, and it was happening even before I was born.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, treat me like a human being.
Yeah.
Right? And in your profession, be professional.
Yeah. And it gives people no comfort when people say these are a few isolated incidents, and they automatically go to the defensive rather than thinking about taking what you did, which is you reported to the captain, right? So if people started doing that on a regular basis and didn't give people a pass just because they have a badge, and didn't give people trouble just because they're black or this color of their skin, I think that's the point, is we're holding each other accountable regardless of our standing or upbringing or relationship or skin color or whatever.
Yeah, so one of the problems is, say for example, there's a young lady in the community, you know, she has a heart for the community. She's not involved in anything that I know of that, you know, would say, man, your character is terrible, right? So she's talking at this gathering to, you know, the commissioner of the police department, but she has attitude and all of these things and so forth. And I just feel like, ooh, just as much as I could say, like, Owens, the way you're talking, nobody's listening to that. At least the people that you may want to convey the message to, they're not hearing that.
Yeah.
So here's this lady, and she's trying to convey a message, and what she's saying is true, but I'm sure the commissioner was like, I ain't hearing that, right?
Yeah.
And so what I did was I went over to her and said, I would represent you in front of them in the respect of going forward and dealing with trying to fix some issues that were going on here in the community. Talk to the captain the same way, like, hey, what she was saying there is accurate, it was on. But how she communicated it was not going to, I didn't see no resolve, right? And I think the tension of, you know, being upset, emotional, reactive, plays a big part in, like, oh, because, right, let's be honest, like, you know, white people write letters, they get things done, right? And people listen. But if you walk in a place, and that's even, you know, like a bias, right? If I come in there with a scarf, or if I came in there with a do-rag on, and I'm saying like, hey man, these are true, and this is what's happening in my community, you're like, yeah, whatever, man, right? Like, when I present myself with a suit and tie, and look, you know, the part, and cut myself well, and you know, you start to hear me a little differently,
yeah,
right? And they're both saying the same thing, but what you're saying, it's how you're saying it, right? And it goes back to what we were talking about, even on the other side. So here's the other side of that coin.
Yeah, and something should be said about death threats against police officers are wrong.
Absolutely.
Right? And there are people who are living in fear, families that are living in fear of police officers, and that's wrong. And I think the problem is there's a lot of polarizing. You're on this side or that side, but Christians are supposed to be on neither side. We're in the middle because we serve God and we don't serve man, you know? So wrapping this up, this conversation, which I think has been extremely helpful, and I hope it's helpful to the people who are watching at home, want to ask you this controversial question. Black Lives Matter. I got a lot of flack on one side for saying it. I get a lot of flack on the other side for not saying it. I feel like as a statement, Black Lives Matter is a great statement, right? We're speaking up for the marginalized. All lives matter, everybody knows that. But just like we would do with abortion, right? We wouldn't just say abortion is important and like, well, everybody's important and people die all the time. We are highlighting an issue. As an organization, I can't stand behind the organization because of a difference in philosophy on how things get done. You know, their stance on defund the police. I don't believe in that. So how do you feel about that statement, and how do you feel about the organization?
Good question. So Black lives do matter, right? Mm-hmm. They need to matter to us, right? Originally, when I first heard the term, I was all lives matter, right? Because that's a gospel truth, right? Hearing the truth of what is saying there is true. Black lives do matter, and they should matter to us in this nation. As far as the organization, the policies I don't agree with myself, right? However, the way it started, like when you look at Trayvon Martin and you look at George Zimmerman getting acquitted, right? Like, again, how does that happen?
Yeah.
Right? And so I just think that that's the wrong angle to approach modeling how Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
So if I was the CEO of Black Lives Matter, I would probably, and I had the funding to do it, right? I would probably deal with dads. I would say, hey, we gotta figure out a way to employ people and get really some good resources flowing in our community, right? How we would have to show people like, hey, we value one another. And there's people doing that, and I know them personally, like that are doing, you know, the whole kings stop killing kings, you know, that whole controversy. So there's people doing it, right? Believers and non-believers, right? I'm a voice of that in my community, right? But we need to show the world that we value one another. Because I just believe that nobody is going to value you or your race more than you value it yourself. And so if we've portrayed something in order to survive out of the ghetto, rap sells, and the message of it sells, but it's an influence, and it has influenced a world. But here's the thing I thought about earlier was rap music has entered into white homes and other homes, right? It has a different effect, right? And we need to begin to teach people how to be wise with their resources.
Right.
So, right, when I talk to a drug dealer, right, you're not saved, you're not coming to Christ, at least, hey, don't make this a career. Because even if you, look, there's communities across the nation, the world, that are not high in crime, but everybody in the community is not a believer.
Yeah.
Right? So if you have people that had working jobs and had the proper family structure, right, that alone. So I would want to invest more in that on a natural level than, you know, waiting for the, you know, the Trayvon Martins, the Aubreys, the Floyds, you know, those things are popping up, they're coming up, and then everybody's jumping on that bandwagon. Nah, every day I got a problem here, right? Even the way gangs deal with one another, it's degrading, you know? And so, for me, it's the statement, Black Lives Matter, they matter to me, right? And maybe that's why I have so much passion about this subject, right? But I care about all lives because I care about souls, right? But I see diversity, right? And that's why I think God has cultivated that here in this church specifically, because we want to love everyone. We want to love the homosexual. We want to love the person that doesn't act like us. the person that comes straight off the street that smells, right? We want to love them. We want to love them, and we want to have opportunity to give them Jesus.
Right, and we can disagree. We can disagree with the CEO of BlackLivesMatter and still love him, right, and pray that he comes to know Jesus like we do. Right. And I think that's the point too, is that's not to say that everything they've done is bad. They started a national, global conversation around this topic. Mm-hmm. People are more aware of it. People can start thinking of ways to change it. Right. But that doesn't mean that to love someone means to accept everything they believe and own it as your own. Mm-hmm. You know, so I think right now in this moment that we're living in, having conversations but learning to love people that don't have the same views as us, political, non-political, religious, non-religious, and looking to God first and foremost as servants of God for him to give us the initiatives that will change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just think even as the scriptures tell us to love others higher than ourselves, yeah, right? And here's people hurt. And if you don't sit at a table, like let's say with that CEO, as a believer, and you just say, I can't stand your policies, mm-hmm, you didn't bridge the gap.
Yeah.
Right? However, you could have a reasonable, a professional conversation and then have opportunity. Maybe that person solely, I don't know them, but maybe their policies are solely like that because their souls haven't been won to Jesus. Now they have this platform and they can say, hey, we're going in this direction with this. Yeah. And you could be used to make an effect in that person's life. Amen. But we look at, their policies, we look at the political stance. Mm-hmm. And we say, oh no, cut them off. And so many people, and I've done this, so many people know what we're not for more than they can understand what we are for, because we've cut off people and we've marginalized people and we just say, nope, 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 wrong, wrong, wrong. Whether it's, doctrinal truths or even, things that happen in life. That didn't happen to me, and I'm saying, no, that's not the heart that I see that the epistles call us to live to, that the gospels show us that Jesus modeled. And so I'm saying, hey, and it's definitely not the spirit-filled life, right? Because even when the Holy Spirit comes upon you and you got the gifts of the Spirit, what did Paul say? He said, the greatest of these is love. Yeah. Love is not just, I love you, bro. You suffer with one another. You mourn with one another, mm-hmm, right? You hear them, and your heart should be moved with compassion. Even if you don't agree, you can hear, and then you can dialogue, opposed to, you're just off, and I cut you off. You don't care about the relationship if you just cut you off. And
so as we're drawing this to a close, I don't know if you have any closing words to the people that are watching at home around this conversation, maybe something specific God has put on your heart for this time.
Well, I thought of two things. One, I shared yesterday on an interview, and I just think it's so fitting for what we're talking about in light of who we are, right? So it says, let love be without hypocrisy, abhor what is evil, cling to what is good, be kindly affectionate to one another with brotherly love, in honor giving preference to one another, not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. Rejoice in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing steadfastly in prayer. Then it says, distributing to the needs of the saints, giving to hospitality. But then it says, bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind towards one another. Do not set your mind on high things, but associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own opinion. And I just really feel
That's
like
good. Yeah.
that's where the church needs to be right now, right? I have an opinion, but I'm willing to hear, right? I'm willing to understand, you know, different worldviews so that I can ultimately have the opportunity to meet people where they are and then build them in the things that we know are eternal, and that's salvation. And even in the church to, hey, you know what, let's cry together. You know what, I'm sorry, I never saw that way. There may be things I do and say that I would never know if you don't share it with me. Mm-hmm. It's a blind spot. Maybe I thought it was right. Here's a good case in point, right? Early on in my walk, I went to California, and I used to use the word nigger freely, right? And a black friend of mine, that's a pastor, said to me, hey man, why you use that word? Now, on the East Coast, it wasn't offensive, but that was just part of my vocabulary at the time, right? And he asked me a question. He said, and at this time, we weren't pastors. He said to me, he said, would you ever use that word in the pulpit? And I said, And once I can conclude no, it left. I surrendered that. It was a blind spot.
Yeah.
If he had never said anything to me, maybe I'd been going to California here, and just only time you wouldn't hear it is when I had opportunities to share, but because he was willing to put himself out there, I was able to learn, think about something, and then move forward. And that's what I think now is a time for listening, for grieving with one another, and then, hey, how can we move forward together, and really showing that arms and arms locked in together. And so that's where I'm at, because as I was talking to you earlier, in Amos, there's a judgment that God is bringing on people that's not hearing the word, and people that's not responding, and people that's oppressing the poor. And there's a cry, right? And are we gonna listen to the cry, not as a bellyache, and we're gonna say, oh, that's a whine, or we're gonna listen to the cry of the people? And that's my question, right? What part of history, what side of history will you be on? Will you miss the opportunities because you were so right in your politics, but so wrong when it came to touching people and being effective in that? And I pray the church, because I believe we're on the brink of a fresh revival. Yeah. I really believe that, right? I believe there's a shift that is taking place, right? I was sensing that before the quarantine whole thing happened, and God is doing it. And there's been some prophetic word that has been spoken, that has been presented, and I just really, really believe that right now is the time that God is doing that. And I want to be a part of that. I don't want to miss that, all right? We prayed too long to miss it now, right? like Lord, we've been crying out. Thank you, God.
Amen. So maybe we can start the conversation right now in the comments section. Just if you do comment, keep in mind everything we talked about today. Be respectful. Be willing to listen. Before, the Bible says in James, let every man be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. So maybe we can facilitate some of that conversation today in the comments. And if not in the comments online, always the best way to have a conversation is in person. And until we get out of quarantine, maybe Zoom chat's the way to do it. But God bless you guys. Thank you, Pastor Ray, for joining us, and hope to see you again soon.